Welcome to this presentation from BRCGS on position statements in relation with the GFSI benchmark in 2024. This presentation is in relation with BRCGS Agents and Brokers Issue 3. I will be your presenter for today. I'm Merce Sanchez, Program Manager for Food Standards. In December 2024, GFSI issued the Benchmarking Requirements 2024. All schedule owners reviewed the requirements, and there was extensive discussions regarding certain aspects of the documents before agreement was reached on how to proceed with the benchmarking process. As a result, the start date for the formal benchmarking process was extended several times. All standards seeking recognition against benchmarking 2024 were required to submit their applications by the 13th of May 2026. BRCGS submitted the application for benchmark recognition for all the 4 standards before the deadline. The food safety, storage and distribution, and agents and brokers standards are currently benchmarked against the previous 2020 benchmarking requirements. As part of the benchmarking process, BRCGS was required to submit all documents related with the management of its certification programs, including the protocol and other BRCGS procedures. In addition, BRCGS was required to complete the relevant Part 3 assessment, which are specific to individual food chain categories such as F2, food broker, and agents. During this process, the requirements within the standard were compared against the relevant benchmarking requirements to determine whether any updates were necessary to achieve compliance. This review was completed for all the standards and that resulted with the publication of the position statements outlining the requirements changes. All position statements related with the benchmarking 2024 included 3 months period implementation, allowing auditors, certification bodies, and sites enough time to review and implement the changes before the next audit. All requirements become auditable the last 10th of August 2026. When we talk about the agents and brokers, there are several aspects that has been modified. The first is related with clause 2.7. This clause has been amended to strengthen alignment with the GFSI HACCP 1.3 requirement, ensuring prerequisites programs are clearly identified and considered within the scope of the hazard and risk management system. Prerequisites programs are not longer seen as something that sides alongside the hazard analysis. They are an integral part of the food safety system and need to be considered from the very beginning. The revisit requirement makes it clear that prerequisites programs should already be in place before the hazard risks analysis is carried out. Companies need to identify the controls they require to implement, then effectively document them, and where appropriate, verify that they are working as intended. Why this is important? Because prerequisites programs provide the foundation of the HACCP or HARA plan. They help control many of the routine or generic hazards that exist in any operation, allowing the hazard analysis to focus on the risk that requires more specific controls. Without effective prerequisites, the HACCP plan is being built on weak foundations. Another important aspect of this change is the expectation that information from prerequisite programs is actively used when developing and reviewing the hazard analysis. In other words, this should not be treated as a separate activity. The effectiveness of the prerequisites programs should influence how risks are assessed and managed within the overall food safety system. The clause also puts greater emphasis on the implementation. It's not enough simply to have procedures written down. Relevant prerequisites programs need to be identified, maintained, and managed on an ongoing basis. They need to work in practice and continue to support the control of the food safety hazards throughout the operations. The standard also recognizes that the risk-based approach is needed. Not every prerequisite program will require validation, but where appropriate, organizations should carry out verification activities to make sure that the controls remain effective over time. And that the phrase where appropriate is an important one. It gives companies flexibility to apply the requirement in the way that makes sense for their products, process, and level of risk. The next position statement related with the GFSI benchmarking is related with the clause 361. Companies have always been expected to have specifications in place and to agree them with their customers. What change in the standard now gives greater clarity on the type of food safety information that may need to be included. The revisit clause specifically refers to food safety parameters such chemical, microbiological, physical, and allergens criteria. The intention is not to suggest that every specification must contain all these elements. Instead, organizations should determine what is relevant based on the nature of the product and how it will be used. For example, a microbiological specification might be critical for one product, while allergen control or chemical limits might be the key concern for another. The important point is that food safety requirements are clearly defined and documented where they are relevant. Another key element within this update is that the specification should be based on evidence. Any food safety parameter included within the specification should be supported by legislation, recognized guidance, customer requirements, or sound scientific principles. This helps to ensure that the specifications are not simply based on tradition or preference, but are linked to real food safety needs. The clause also reinforces the importance of providing sufficient information to allow products to be used safely. Depending on the product, this could include details such as ingredients and allergens, storage conditions, shelf life, handling instructions, preparation requirements, or quantity information. In other words, the specifications should contain the information needed by the customer to handle and use the product correctly and safely. Overall, these updates is around improving the clarity and consistency. It helps organizations understand what information should be considered when developing food safety specification and ensure that those specifications are rooted in both regulatory requirements and scientific understanding. The third position statement related with agents and brokers issue 3 and the GFSI benchmarking is related with the clause 431. While organizations have always been expected to conduct threat assessments, the revisit clause provides much greater clarity on the knowledge and capabilities needed to do this effectively. People involved need to understand the product being traded, the specific activities carried out by the business, and the types of security threats that could realistically affect those products or operations. The revisit requirement, therefore, places a stronger emphasis on the competency. Individuals or team responsible for food defense need to have a clear understanding on food defense principles and be able to identify potential threats that are relevant on their own business. The quality of the threat assessment depends heavily on that understanding. One thing that is important to note is that the standard does not prescribe exactly how to complete the competency must be demonstrated. There is no requirement for a specific training course of qualification. Companies have the flexibility in how they develop and demonstrate competence. This may come through formal training, practical experience, previous knowledge of food defense, or simply through the quality and effectiveness of the assessment being carried out. In addition, organizations are expected to comply with any applicable legal requirements relating to the training or competency. This provides an extra level of assurance that food defense programs are being developed and implemented and maintained by sustainability knowledge personnel. Ultimately, this update is about increasing confidence in the food defense process. The standard is recognized that an effective threat assessment depends not only on the methodology being used, but also on the competency of the people carrying it out. And the last position statement related with agents and brokers, issue 3, and the GFSA benchmarking 2024 is related with the clause 4A2. This update reflects the important principle. The quality of the vulnerability assessment depends not only on the process being followed, but also on the knowledge and expertise of the people carrying it. In the past, organizations may have focused primarily on the completing the assessment itself. The revisit requirement places greater emphasis on ensuring that the individuals involved have a genuine understanding on the food fraud risks and can effectively evaluate where vulnerabilities may exist within their products, raw materials, and supply chain. People involved in the vulnerability assessment need to understand the principles of the food fraud, the factors that can make a product vulnerable to fraud, and the techniques used to assess any prioritized risks. They should also have sufficient knowledge on the product and supply chain they are reviewing so that potential fraud opportunities can be identified realistically. One of the strengths on the revisit clause is that it does not prescribe a single way to demonstrate competence. As we mentioned before on the previous position statements, the requirement is not specific against qualification or training courses. Companies are flexible to how they ensure competency, whether through the formal training, practical experience, industry knowledge, or by demonstrating that their vulnerability assessments are robust and effective. The key requirement is that the people involved have the knowledge necessary to make informed decisions and carry out meaningful assessments effectively to evaluation process. Ultimately, the purpose of this update is to improve the quality and credibility of the vulnerability assessments by ensuring that the people involved have the right knowledge and experience. Businesses will be better equipped to identify vulnerabilities, protect its supply chains, and maintain confidence in the products they provide to their customers. Thank you so much for your attention. Please don't hesitate to raise any inquiry or any question about these position statements and send your questions to the mail that it's attached. Thank you so much for your attention. Bye.